This is a tie-in because it provides ancillary information for the main event. Some of this was material rejected from parts 4 and 5 due to them already being stuffed full with information, and not necessarily needed, though it will be helpful far down the line. The title of this part is a reference to the documentary series by James Burke, whose approach to fusing information via connectivity to illustrate underlying causality is obviously a strong influence on my own approach. And given how much changing of the universe takes place, it seemed fitting. To kick this part off, let's go back to one of the lingering relics of the 70s and that emerging marvel of the early 80s, when the death of Captain Marvel and Contest of Champions kicked off Marvel's graphic novel line and miniseries. Now this is actually set about 2 years before that, and we kicked this off in Marvel 2-in-1, the book that had drawn the final curtain on Thanos, and was being written by Mark Gruenwald, a big-time continuity hound for Marvel, and who decided to tie together a few bits and pieces in a 3-issue story, amusingly putting Ben Grimm in the middle of matters of cosmic scope. In issue number 61, we see some guys pull a cocoon like Warlocks out of the sea, which soon opens, and next thing poor thing knows, some golden woman in a red swimsuit bursts in while he's trying to have a romantic night with his girlfriend. But Alicia Masters is the one that she's after. As I mentioned previously, the scientists who made Warlock survived, tried again, and created a dude named Paragon in Incredible Hulk Annual number 6. But wasn't done cooking yet and went back in. Now the dude's a chick, and since Warlock was originally called him, she is calling herself her. The change is so that she and Warlock can breed and create a super race. But Thing needs to track her down and uses one of Reed's gizmos to try. Well, instead, Starhawk shows up, one of the OG Guardians of the Galaxy. He had just finished up that business with Korvac, and so when he picked up her, he was wondering if actually she was a sign that Korvac wasn't actually defeated. See, if you haven't read Korvac yet, I'm going to assume that you probably don't plan to. Shooter wanted to tell a story where the all-powerful villain had a noble purpose in his conquest, and the heroes were wrong to oppose him. Moondragon lamented their victory over Korvac, that by doing so they'd done a horrible thing. Of course, this is the same Moondragon who made herself a goddess and dominated a planet to bring about peace, so her opinion on such topics is dubious. Gruenwald, it seems, had a real problem with that. He wrote an issue of the series What If to explore if Korvac had lived, and showed this was not some act of benevolence. He was a dominating dictator, who repays Moondragon's adulation and requests to aid him by killing her. As an even bigger screw you, when the Korvac saga was collected into a trade paperback after Shooter had been fired from Marvel, Gruenwald wrote a coda to the story where the Avengers show up at the grave of Korvac and proceed to talk shit about him. They say maybe he wanted to do something good, but this guy was a real dick. It seems to me that for Gruenwald, Korvac was like his one more day, in that it was this big blotch that he just couldn't quite stand was there and knocked it down at every opportunity. So, this is the reason why Starhawk, announced on the cover, shows up in this book about 8 pages from the end, because of Korvac. Not satisfied enough, though, with that, Moondragon shows up fresh from the Korvac saga, who relates what happened to Warlock to her and offers to take her to his grave on Counter-Earth, in Moondragon's ship. Boy, you know, heroes with pronouns for names are really hard. In issue number 62, recovering from the shellacking that Her gave to Starhawk, Thing takes them to Reed's spaceship garage, and going really old school, they break up the Skrull ship that the FF snatched way back in Fantastic Four number 2. Like I've said, Gruenwald loves his Marvel history. Meanwhile, Moondragon has taken Her and Alicia to the moon of Counter-Earth, which is actually the High Evolutionary's ship. He appears to be dead, but that's when Grimm and Starhawk show up. They have a hyperdrive or something on that Skrull ship, hence the reason why they brought it. They were able to cover the distance that much faster. Well, fights, of course, break out, and when Moondragon repeatedly refuses to let Thing rescue his girlfriend and tries attacking him again and again with physical blows when he's, well, entirely made of rock, he finally gets annoyed and, well, I know this might seem a bit sexist, but Moondragon's got a big ego. She thinks she's a goddess and thinks she's superior to other human beings. So I must admit, the sight of Thing getting irritated enough to put her over his knee and give her a spanking is actually kind of satisfying. Just to see her taken down a peg, I mean. Thanks to Alicia, the fighting stops and they turn to the matter of the High Evolutionary, who is not dead, but rather his mind is separated and must be drawn back. I hate when that happens. The High Evolutionary explains that when Warlock returned to the solar system and fought the stranger on the moon, I hate when that happens too, he came here and ranted at his father figure, claiming that Counter-Earth had been destroyed despite the High Evolutionary's promise. In his rage, Warlock lashed out with the Soul Gem, and it was only the emergency power of the High Evolutionary's armor that protected him by evolving him into a disembodied consciousness so that he would survive. They explain why they're here, to raise Warlock from the dead so he can breed with her and create a master race, and there is nothing creepy in any element of that plot. Problem is that Counter-Earth is gone, and when he looks, the High Evolutionary can see this time, actually it really is gone. So he tracks the planet to where it's been taken, bringing us to issue 63. And a rarity, a team-up book with the character teaming up is in fact dead, as it is Warlock. They track Counter-Earth and find there are spheres around it, so using the High Evolutionary's advanced technology, Thing brings her, Starhawk, and Moondragon over to confront the beings who are responsible, which now begins really bringing in the Starlin. When Warlock was taken over by Starlin, an alien being in a glass helmet narrated his backstory. Well, he and all his friends are the ones who are behind this. Sphinxor, who after some fighting beams Thing, Alicia, and the High Evolutionary over to suss this out. Sphinxor knew Warlock's backstory because he was here to watch it, being asked to relocate this planet when advanced aliens called the Beyonders detected that he was making it. Sensing Warlock wouldn't allow it, they seized the opportunity after his crucifixion to mess with his soul gem in the hopes that unlocking its vampiric appetites would compel Warlock to leave, thus explaining the change between the two eras. When Warlock returned, they used their interface with the soul gem to convince Warlock that he was now a giant, when he actually wasn't, and, when that faded, convinced him the planet was just gone. The High Evolutionary hears everything, and knowing Counter-Earth actually had a flaw that the Beyonders could fix, he agrees that they can take the planet. But after the exhuming of Warlock by her, who has been insisting that their nature will allow Warlock's restoration with her help. However, it is only his body that is restored. His soul is still in the soul gem, remember. So she puts his body back and departs. Her was clearly created as a vehicle for Grunwald to put some closure on the whole Warlock Counter-Earth thing, as he had no further plans for the character for, about a decade. Aside of a couple background appearances in Contest of Champions, Her would not return until a 4-part storyline leading up to Alpha Flight's 100th issue, and after that, when Grunwald brought her back into things during Infinity Gauntlet. So, what happened to the High Evolutionary after that? Well, quite simply, and not to put too fine a point on it, he went gaga. Counter-Earth, his crowning achievement, put on display in a museum by beings who viewed its achievement as akin to finding a flint arrowhead. The idea that he was nowhere near the level of godhood that he thought he was so broke him that he wanted to just end it. This is seen in Incredible Hulk 266, when Rick and Betty suddenly transform into the form of their ape-like ancestors. Bruce Banner tracks the source of this to a cave and finds the High Evolutionary, who explains that his armor is the issue here. He can't kill himself, so he's tried de-evolving himself, but the armor bounced it off himself and onto anyone else. It's only Banner's irradiated body that's protecting him. So the High Evolutionary finally gets Banner to change, and eventually goads the Hulk into smashing his suit enough so that he devolves back into slime. And that, for 7 years, was the last anyone had ever seen of the High Evolutionary. So when he came back in a big way. Over our journey, you've no doubt noticed how the annuals would tie together. The way that West Coast Avengers and Avengers told two halves of the story against the Grandmaster. The Avengers Annual and Marvel 2-in-1 Annuals that told the two halves of the story of the death of Warlock and the final defeat of Thanos. Even the Avengers issue with the genetics bomb that locked the Skrulls into their forms and prevented shape changing, that was actually shared with a Fantastic Four annual that essentially told the same story except from the FF's point of view. The idea came around for the annuals in 1988. They would all give different glimpses into the machinations of the master villain, and that villain was the now returned High Evolutionary. This event, called the Evolutionary War, suffers from the problem that there is, no pun intended, evolution of the story over the event. Everything has a connection in some way to the High Evolutionary, sure, but there's little sign of an overall progression in his goals throughout most of it. This shortcoming would be addressed a bit better in the following year's Atlantis attacks, but even that showed there were limitations, and after that they wisely went with limiting it to stories across 3 or 4 annuals, such as revisiting previous characters and ideas, the Korvac Quest, Days of Future Present, and Return of the Original Defenders, for example. And what's interesting is that this provides a snapshot as we go through this. If you look at the Evolutionary War, which was typically made by the creative team on the regular series, it's akin to examining a slice from a core sample that shows a picture of the moment of time. This is just a couple of years before the return of Thanos. It's at a time when no one would know that such a major cosmic event was coming. While the High Evolutionary himself would not be involved with Thanos, it was the first time besides Secret Wars 2 that a single villain would tie in with so many different and varied books, from the Punisher to the Silver Surfer. It also plays into what will happen after Infinity Gauntlet when it comes to the High Evolutionary. We'll step in on the whole event, but if you are interested in reading this for yourself and want more of a focus on the real event of it and not all the peripheral crap, I would suggest reading the 3 X books followed by the 2 Avengers books. They're pretty much the meat of this thing. So, it kicks off in X Factor Annual number 3. X Factor was finally doing what 2 previous attempts hadn't succeeded at, putting the original X-Men back together on a team. Usually that was just Angel, Iceman, and Beast, but now Cyclops and Jean Grey are here too. The 5 of them have been dealing with a baddie by the name of Apocalypse. They're involved in one of the High Evolutionary mandates. He's removing the genetically unfit from the equation, and at the moment that involves the mutoids that usually work for Mole Man. He has hordes of purifiers and special exosuits to do it, though they're rounding them up to be sterilized and not massacred. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that that's nice. I'm just saying that he's not slaughtering people down there or anything. Things are a bit different than what you might expect. Beast has gone old school with his human look but huge-ass feet, and he's gotten, well, kind of dumb. Well, they figure out one of the mutoids is actually a mutant, one with psychic abilities, and so he's able to turn the terrified creatures into a berserker mob. Meanwhile, Apocalypse confronts the High Evolutionary about their differences in approaches. Apocalypse sows conflict to make humanity strong. The High Evolutionary would try to cheat his way there. So first they try kicking the crap out of each other, then they debate the merits of the mutant mutoid. In the end, the High Evolutionary says his goal is to elevate the rest of the human race to his level, and Apocalypse just laughs at him. Where do we go from there, then? Well, naturally, we would have to go to the Punisher. Punisher Annual number 1. This is very, very, very not in step with the others. The minions of the High Evolutionary enter the story because drugs create the genetically unfit, so they're here in Bogota for the same reason that Frank Castle is. However, they go about it by slaughtering everybody, which is very much not in keeping what the High Evolutionary had said in the last part, arguing that the difference between him and Apocalypse was that between life and death. His people are very much opting for death. Well, Frank Castle can play that game too, and he refers to this with the effectiveness of his 5.66mm rifle. He repeatedly refers to his 5.66mm rifle. Personally, I think he should have gone with 5.56. It'd be way easier to find ammo. Suffice to say, there's a lot of shooting and corpses, and Frank takes down one of the aerial transports with a rocket launcher because he's got a tool for every occasion. This one is unique. It's the only part of the Evolutionary War where the High Evolutionary doesn't make an appearance. All the other ones, he makes at least a cameo. The event continues in Silver Surfer Annual number 1. In this story, the High Evolutionary asks for help from the Eternals. You might have heard of them. They had a movie, although given the reception, you might not have heard of the Eternals. Anyway, he wants genetic information from the Surfer, and they agree that they'll go get it for him. Except that when the Surfer returns to Earth, he runs into the Super Skrull, who is reincorporating his body after being turned into a sort of energy all around the Earth. There's a fight, and then they wind up in the custody of the Eternals, but Surfer doesn't want to share his DNA with the High Evolutionary unless he knows what it's being used for. Plus, he's got other things to worry about right now. Remember that genetics bomb that locked all the Skrulls in their shape so they can't change anymore? Well, the Super Skrull is the only one that didn't happen to on account of being energy and not matter at the time. So he could be the key to saving his people. That's a lot more important. Even if the Silver Surfer didn't care about the Skrulls in the slightest, and he has compassion for just about everybody, the fact is the Kree-Skrull War keeps drawing assholes to his planet, and he's getting kind of tired of having to constantly go back there and defend it from someone who's been offended by some stupid reason. So the Surfer then leaves to confront the High Evolutionary to ask what's going on. But he doesn't, because that's when Nova contacts him about Galactus dying, remember? And so that's got to take priority. So that's why he does not get further involved with the Evolutionary War. The crossover event continues in New Mutants Annual number 4, when for a time Magneto was running things because Charles Xavier was out in space. Speaking of bald men in space, I keep thinking of Captain Picard on the grounds that Magneto runs this place exactly like his brother Robert would. It really pisses off Sunspot, who wants to keep doing things behind Magneto's back, because he just runs them like he's some kind of dictator. Especially because one of their friends gets kidnapped by the High Evolutionary's goons, and Sunspot wants to go and rescue them. Well, this time they didn't kidnap her to sterilize her, but rather to remove her powers. The High Evolutionary doesn't want such things to be a threat to humanity after his big plan is carried out. The White Queen gets a phone call about this, and she informs Magneto so that the Hellfire Club can go deal with it. Well, he tells the kids to stay, and like hell they're going to stay. They use Illyana's power to teleport them into the lair of the High Evolutionary's goons. During the fight, Mirage gets knocked onto some equipment, so her power changes. Before, she would create images of what people feared most. Now, she actually conjures it into reality. It results in this creature, a possible future evolution of human beings. And I gotta say, what a waste of a good monster. Yeah, it's got some xenomorph to it, sure, but that tiny second head really adds to it nicely. I'd like to see more of them showing up. In the comics, obviously. So they finish the rescue, and just in time for the Hellfire Club to arrive. Apparently the Black King came straight from the showers and didn't bother to get dressed. We continue the event in the first of 3 Spider-Man books to have an annual. Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 22. The newly married Spider-Man crashes some drug pushers, webs them up, and tells a passing cop about it so the police can handle it. Except the news announces those guys are all slaughtered, and that Spider-Man is to blame. Matt Murdock knows that Spidey isn't a cold-blooded killer, and so does the Kingpin, who is blaming this on the same guys that mixed it up with the Punisher in Bogota. So he's trying to find them. Spidey and Daredevil team up to find him, and a new character is also getting involved, Speedball. Speedball had simultaneously launched with his own series, which gave him his origin, although this issue technically came out first. The series lasted for 10 issues before it was canceled, and I guess that's justifiable, as the consensus I've read about it was, I'm a huge fan of Speedball, and even I think this is pretty bad. Anyway, Speedball witnesses the High Evolutionary's goons exterminate drug dealers, but this is small time. The Empire State Building will unleash a signal to put everyone in New York to sleep and allow them to eliminate all those whose genetics wouldn't contribute to the High Evolutionary's plans. Not sure what that says about New York, that it's the only place that they try this, but whatever. Speedball overhears and goes to stop them. As does Spider-Man and Daredevil. See, the Kingpin tortures the information out of a captured goon using nothing but his bare hands, and then has the Arrangers slip that data discreetly to Spidey and Daredevil. Their only contribution is taking out the bad guys, but it's Speedball himself that's the one that shuts down the transmitter, and that's how he's introduced to the world of superheroes. And nothing happened that ever made him not be a jocular goofball kid. The event continues in Fantastic Four Annual number 21. Steve Englehart had taken over the book and took it in a new direction to shake it up. Reed and Sue took time off to spend with Franklin, and Ben Grimm was left to lead the team. Now, John Byrne had had a much celebrated run on the Fantastic Four before Englehart, and one of the last things he did was have Johnny Storm hook up with Alicia, who had traditionally been Ben Grimm's love interest, as you saw from the earlier Marvel 2-in-1. So John Byrne left, and Roger Stern was left to write fill-in issues, and I'm not sure who decided this. It might have been that these were always the plans that John Byrne had, or perhaps it was dictated by the book's editor. But either way, the decision was made that in issue number 300, Johnny and Alicia would be married. So this is all fresh when Steve Englehart takes over, and when Ben Grimm is set up to create the new team. Well, it seems that subconsciously that really bothered Ben Grimm, because when Crystal asked to join the team, he said, "Oh, yes, definitely yes." If you don't know, Crystal is Johnny's ex-girlfriend. She got married to Quicksilver instead. So, we got her on the team, we got Ben, we got Johnny. Who's left? Ms. Marvel. No, not that Ms. Marvel. No, not that Ms. Marvel either. Remember what I said about names? Use them or lose them? Yeah. Sharon Ventura had the name this time, and what happened was an incident where she and the Thing wound up being bombarded by cosmic rays. So she mutated into a Thing as well, and he mutated even further. Well, things are shaking up again. After finally getting home after a long exertion and getting cleaned up, the team get a visit from the royal family of the Inhumans. Crystal is one of them, if you didn't know. She was also, that marriage to Quicksilver, it kind of sort of made Johnny Depp and Amanda Heard look stable. Quicksilver is returned after a bunch of complications and losing his speed powers in the West Coast Avengers, also written by Englehart. So the royal family wants Crystal to resume and pick up her relationship with her husband. Shockingly, she says no. They try to take her by force, and she responds with force, and a brouhaha breaks out. Meanwhile, the High Evolutionary has shown up since it's his event, and he needs the Inhuman Terrigen Mist for his plans. While his minions go get to work on that, the Watcher shows up to shoot the breeze, which is easy on account of this is the blue area of the moon. Quicksilver leads the counterattack against the High Evolutionary's forces, but more help is needed, so the royal family and the FF head up there to join in. To be clear, this hasn't resolved their dispute, it's just that they have to table it for now on account of the invasion. They defeat the minions and the High Evolutionary departs, but the Watcher refuses to share any of this with the Fantastic Four. Although he does have to intervene on account of a second Watcher, Aaron, is prepared to tell them. We all have underlings that don't know the rules at work. In the end, Black Bolt takes Crystal to the very edge of the blue area where the air is extremely thin, so he can ask her to stay with his own voice, without turning her into paste, I mean. She decides to, so that wraps that up. We'll get back to the Fantastic Four later, But right now, we should continue the event. This brings us to X-Men Annual number 12, and oh boy, it's really time to get into things. There's a lot of moving parts here. You saw that Magneto was running Professor X's school for the New Mutants, on account of him being off in space. And the original X-Men were now X-Factor, and operated out of a sentient ship. Did I mention they had a sentient ship? They have a sentient spaceship. So, what about the X-Men themselves? Well, they're presumed dead. They're not, though. There are 8 of them. Storm, Rogue, Dazzler, Psylocke, Colossus, Havoc, Longshot, and Wolverine. They're operating out of the Australian outback and a high-tech base taken from the bad guys. They're not alone. Helping them get around is a silent Aborigine mutant named Gateway with teleportation powers. Also, I mentioned Jean Grey was with X-Factor. That was after she came back from the dead. Before that, Cyclops was married to a clone of Jean named Madeline Pryor. Now that Jean is back, he dropped his wife like, well, kind of an asshole. Eventually, Madeline Pryor will become a supervillain. Go figure. But for right now, she's on the good guy's side, operating all the equipment in the X-Men's new base so the 8 of them can go out and do their thing. That's enough backstory for you? No! Remember when Vision tricked Captain Marvel into heading out to Thanos' old ship, Sanctuary 2? Well, while she was busy being kidnapped by Nebula's mercenaries, the Avengers had a real problem back on Earth. There was this giant robot thing in the Savage Land named Terminus that was basically destroying everything there until finally it eliminated what allowed for that unique prehistoric place to be there and turned it all into a big empty frozen wasteland. Let's now go on to the actual story here. Storm has gone gaga and flown off, and they figure she is heading to the Savage Land, and they are sure surprised when they show up and find that it's, well, the aforementioned barren frozen wasteland. While they try to figure out what happened, the High Evolutionary is also there. Now, the thing you might have noticed, the High Evolutionary is too complex to fit straight into the hero or villain category. I mean, I'll keep referring to him as villain because that's kind of his purpose in this storyline, but really, he follows his own motivations that consequently cause him to skip back and forth between the two sides there. So while, by and large, he's been the antagonist in this event, here he's concerned about what happened to this place. Well, he gets attacked by Terminus, frickin' robot. It seems that this is what drew Storm this way, though, because after the X-Men throw a few attacks at the robot, Rogue rescues the High Evolutionary, and Storm makes her displeasure known, knocking the robot into a mountain and burying it. The High Evolutionary explains that his purpose is to restore the Savage Land, and he has a facility nearby, where Havoc meets Zaladane, his assistant, and they're almost ready to restore the Savage Land. They just need a mutant with a connection to this land. Luckily, there's a good chance they'll find one, as many of the people of the Savage Land have survived. How, you might ask? By escaping into another dimension on a ship on the back of a gigantic invisible dog, of course. Yeesh, do I have to explain the obvious to you? Terminus gets back up and starts attacking again, but they finally crack the robot open and see it piloted by Garak, who eventually they gets to snap out of whatever he's in and realize to his horror what's happened. Well, not to worry, the High Evolutionary can use him to restore the Savage Land, if he is willing to sacrifice himself, which he is. And so, with the place restored, Kazar and Shauna return for future Savage Land shenanigans. The events continue in Web of Spider-Man Annual number 4. You may recall we dipped into Marvel Tales previously, where characters teamed up with Spider-Man. Well, it was realized that circulation rose and fell with the quality of the team-ups. And meanwhile, the book didn't have a lot going for it as far as contributing to the overall story of the character went, especially with a constantly rotating line. So the book was canceled and Web of Spider-Man took its place, so then they could just do crossovers whenever the story supported it. But this also had a bit of a revolving door problem, and that's why this issue is written by, I'm shocked to say, Steve Gerber, creator of Howard the Duck. The reason I'm shocked is this issue is awful. It's the return of the villain no one remotely wanted to see again, the Slug, Miami's answer to the Kingpin, but with a twist. Fisk looks like a fat guy, but is actually incredibly strong. Slug, on the other hand, is just a frickin' blob, and his signature thing is to kill people by stuffing their heads into his rolls of fat and suffocating them. The story again involves drugs, also a little appearance by the Man-Thing, and a new character named Poison. What a massive flop she proved to be. She was given a storyline in Marvel Comics Presents, the anthology book that is most famous for the Weapon X storyline that gave Wolverine's origin, and she had a one-off appearance again in Spider-Man, and finally was brought back by Mark Millar in Wolverine just to kill her, resurrect her, and then kill her again for good. There is nothing here worth saying anything more about, so we're just going to move on. We're now at West Coast Avengers Annual Number 3. This is Part 9 of an 11-part story, and the High Evolutionary is working on finishing up his bomb, which will bring about his glorious vision. Remember all the times I brought up the bomb? No, that's because it hasn't appeared until now. Now you see what I mean about saying there's no evolution to the story. Anyway, there's something that he still needs, vibranium, and that means going to Wakanda. What no one knows is that Bill Foster, aka Black Goliath back in the day, is working for the High Evolutionary and slips a note inside the armor of one of the people going out. He knows T'Challa is going to kick their asses, and sure enough, they find it, and they see the coordinates, the warning, and that they need to get Hank Pym. Problem is, Pym quit. So Hawkeye shows up with the people that he does have, recognizing who Bill Foster is from his name and offering to pitch in. And it's needed, because Wakanda has been invaded by one of the most ill-conceived union of superpowers I can recall in a long time. 6 superpowered people named after the 5 senses plus intuition. Shooting lasers for sight and sonic blasts for sound, well, that's useful. But evading people in the cloud of your own stench, that is a tick villain right there. Well, the bad guys get defeated and the West Coast Avengers head to the coordinates, shocked to see the Savage Land is restored, but also that the citadel of the High Evolutionary is gone. There's just a crater. Ah, but that was but the first of 2 stories in this issue. You get your High Evolutionary money's worth this time. The reason there's a crater has to do with the fact that there has been a schism in the West Coast Avengers, which goes all the way back to one of those common problems, namely, somebody was trapped in the Old West. That somebody was Mockingbird. And Mockingbird had a love potion put on her, things happened, and let's just say afterwards she wanted to kill somebody. I think you can connect those dots pretty well. She didn't directly do it. However, when the person slipped off the edge and was dangling by one hand, she just stood there and let him fall to his death. Well, they say dead men tell no tales, but not in this case. Turns out the guy's spirit, in the present, wound up possessing one of his descendants and told Hawkeye a skewed version of events which he believed over his own wife because, and I cannot emphasize this enough, Hawkeye's kind of an asshole. Hawkeye got all upset because killing is against the Avengers Charter, technically. And so this is the cause of the schism. He says he can't trust Mockingbird anymore, either as a wife or as an Avenger. However, his position backfires because both Tigra and Moon Knight feel that there are times when taking a life is necessary. And therefore, if that's going to be Hawkeye's approach, especially for a guy who it seemed kind of had it coming, then they don't want to be a member of this team anymore either. They're not going to wait around until Hawkeye decides that they need to be thrown out. So the 3 of them go off as their own team. And that's who we're following right now. The trio of nameless Avengers. They show up to find the Savage Land restored despite having heard from the Avengers it had been destroyed, and they learn from Khazar what had happened over in the X-Men side of things. The trio agree to see what this High Evolutionary is up to, and he cheerfully announces he's built a bomb which he plans to use to mutate everyone on Earth. He then gasses them. not anticipating that Moon Knight will be able to resist breathing until his body simply blacks out from lack of oxygen. Eventually, though, even he goes down, and the High Evolutionary puts them in the maze. Because once you've announced your evil plan, you've got to follow it up with a convoluted escape opportunity. The purpose is to get them to fight a robot and see who can get to him first. And it's Mockingbird, as Tiger has a serious thing for Moon Knight at this time and starts, species appropriate, pawing him. Well, as you probably noticed, the High Evolutionary has the power to grow in size, normally just to talk to larger beings on their level, like the Watcher or Galactus. But here he uses it to restrain Mockingbird. But Bill Foster takes this opportunity to become Goliath once again, succeeding in growing to a size to take the High Evolutionary on. It seems this is why he came to work for the guy in the first place. To grow into a giant, I mean, not to beat up a guy in a purple armor. See, the untainted mass that would be drawn upon to give him his size would help him fight back against the cancer. Well, the High Evolutionary is an odd duck. The fact that one of his technicians betrayed him to use his own equipment to give himself superpowers and fight him personally fascinates him. He tells Foster to keep up the good work and then leaves. If only all the bad guys could be so reasonable. His ship flies off and the base self-destructs, leaving the crater that the West Coast Avengers found when they showed up. The penultimate book is the third Spider-Man annual, Spectacular Spider-Man Annual number 8. This is a unique one, in that it is the only series where the Evolutionary War crossed over outside of the annuals, in issues 142 and 143 of that book. Two yahoos who work for the High Evolutionary have been after Gwen Stacy's clone, making Peter aware of her and bringing an interesting dynamic into his marriage. And that is twice now where clones and marital problems have turned up in this part, hasn't it? There's got to be specialists for that in the Marvel Universe by now. MJ is bothered by the fact that, despite Peter's denial, this woman is stirring the same old feelings in him. This story is crammed like the world's strangest double-decker sandwich with the High Evolutionary, who gets the characters called the New Gods involved in things. The High Evolutionary examined them to see if they offered insights as the next stage in human evolution. Clearly, they do not. He's captured the Gwen clone because she's an impressive specimen and he wants to learn more. We'll get to that in a moment. This naturally draws Peter's attention, and so he winds up getting teleported into the lair of the High Evolutionary just before the New Gods then show up. Still, it's really high time, after 2 annuals of just fighting drug lords, that Spider-Man actually ran into the title character of this event. In fact, Conway himself is writing this issue, and has the High Evolutionary address the Gwen Stacy clone thing now. She's not a clone. It's why he wanted to study her, see. He didn't think that the Jackal could pull off such a trick. And he was right. She's a person who was altered to become Gwen Stacy, a copy, but not via cloning. When it's all over, in fact, one of the New Gods restores her back to her former self, so she no longer is Gwen. Then the clone saga happened, and to be honest, let's not think about that. That draws this part of our tie-in to a conclusion. In our next part, we will finish up the Evolutionary War, but we're going to do more than that. This isn't the only thing that was going on connected after all. You'll find out more about what happened with Thor, find out what happened when Steve Englehart decided to make fun of Stan Lee, and also meet a character who was very racist and had a name strikingly similar to a very popular villain. All this and more in part 2 of our From Here to Infinity tie-in.